Hi, I'm Dev.
And I'm Cam.
And you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up.
Do you love listening to the Criminalish podcast? Want to hear more from Kim and Dev? Then consider becoming a subscriber for $2.99 a month. Subscribers will have exclusive access to minisodes, Dev and Cam's live reactions to crime shows and documentaries, as well as early access to any multi-part episodes and so much more. Click the link in the show description if you're interested in subscribing. See y'all in Cell Block C.
So today, I will be continuing to tell Cam about the murder of Timothy Richard McLean, which is better known as the Greyhound bus murder. I am still drinking my iced coffee from an unidentified coffee company, which America may or may not run on. What about you, Cam?
And I, during my break, refilled my cup of green tea with the immune and stress tea bag too.
Good.
Because I needed another cup for this part of the episode.
Exactly. This is your reminder that this case is severely twisted and messed up. And I want you all to understand that the first episode was very tamed and established all the background of everyone involved in this case. But this case will be diving deeply into the more disturbing and twisted elements of this case. So I want to extend massive trigger warnings for detailed descriptions of murder and gore, dismemberment, and cannibalism. So with all that being said, are you ready to get back into our story, friend?
You said cannibalism.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
All right, it is now or never, I guess.
It is now or never. Let's get into it. So last time we left off, Vincent Lee was taking a seat next to Timothy McLean before Timothy fell asleep on the 1170 Greyhound bus from Edmonton to Winnipeg, Canada. So around 8:30 p.m., the 1170 Greyhound bus is traveling down the Trans-Canadian Highway, and Timothy is not awake to witness the very strange things that Vincent starts doing. But other passengers are kind of giving the side eye to what he's doing. First of all, he had on dark sunglasses, and he did not take them off for any reason. He also had a roll of toilet paper and a 2-liter bottle of sweet tea. And remember from the last episode, Vincent had previously sold or burned all of his possessions. So these 3 items are the only thing that Vincent had with him apart from the clothes on his back. And there is actual video of people recording Vincent and how he would drink this sweet tea and how he was acting on the bus. He would drink from the 2-liter water bottle, but he would put the toilet paper roll between his chin and his chest and hold it there as he drank from the 2-liter bottle, as he is seated next to Tim, who is slumped over with his head on the window, asleep. And this little note is not necessarily too important, but it's just another note of how off Vincent's behavior was to every other person on the bus. So people already found the toilet paper thing weird, but then Vincent starts talking to himself and muttering under his breath in a different language, according to other passengers. And unbeknownst to those passengers, the voices in Vincent's head had gotten louder and angrier. And according to Vincent, The voice in his head was telling him that he was in imminent danger because the man sitting next to him was a demon who was going to harm Vincent and all the other passengers on the bus. And if you remember, the man sitting next to Vincent is 22-year-old Timothy Richard McLean, who is asleep with his headphones on. The voices in Vince's head told him that in order to protect himself and everyone on the bus, he would need to destroy the person sitting next to him. The bus had grown relatively dark. A lot of passengers were beginning to fall asleep or were already asleep, as most of them had been on this bus for over 20 hours at this point. And again, this is your final warning for the graphic events of this case. Though we usually do not like to harp on the actual elements of a murder on this podcast, with this case, the elements of the murder are so important that if we don't talk about them, when we talk about what inevitably happens in this case, I don't think you will be able to have proper context and understanding without understanding just how graphic and horrific this case is. If you do still want to listen to the rest of this episode, I will leave specific timestamps for highly graphic information in the description of this episode. So the bus was very calm, very relaxed, and a normal experience for everyone else on there. And unbeknownst to them, Vincent was having all of these horrific, dark thoughts that were telling him that he needed to destroy Timothy. And seemingly out of nowhere, from everyone else's perspective, Vincent grabs his hunting knife that he bought for himself for protection, and he turns over and plunges the knife into Timothy's neck. And this action woke Timothy up from his sleep, and he screamed as he woke up. And passengers on the bus have described this scream as the most blood-curdling scream you have ever heard. And while everyone else on the bus had heard this scream and had started to panic and woke up in a frenzy, wondering what the hell was going on, Vincent was absolutely unfazed and simply pulled the knife out of Timothy's neck before plunging it back in. Now, of course, passengers did not know the full extent of what was going on as Timothy and Vincent were sitting at the back of the bus, but they had heard Timothy's screams of terror. However, there was one man by the name of Garnett, who was 26 years old at the time of this incident and had served 5 years in the Canadian military. He was sitting on the row in front of Vincent and Timothy and was the first person to realize that Vincent had stabbed Timothy. And from the back of the bus, he shouted to everyone, quote, "A knife, a knife. Everyone get off the bus. Everyone get off the bus," end quote. The bus driver was alerted and immediately pulled over onto the side of the highway, and everyone scrambled to get off of the bus. Passengers have described this experience as utter mayhem and chaos. According to several people who were on the bus, people were literally trampling over each other to try and get off of this bus. An elderly woman was pushed down to the ground and out of the way as someone tried to run over her. A mother who was sat in the row across from Vincent and Timothy with her toddler threw her toddler to another passenger a few rows in front of her with hopes that at least her child would be able to get away from this man who was standing over Timothy, continuously stabbing him as Timothy screamed. She too was luckily able to run off the bus and was reunited with her toddler off of the bus. And Vincent was completely silent during his attack of Timothy. There was no scream, there was no anger in his face. He has been described as absolutely blank, as he focused solely on stabbing Timothy. Timothy did try to fight back. There was evidence of defensive wounds on his hands and arms, and at one point he had actually managed to push Vincent off of him and tried to run down the aisle, but he fell down the aisle and was attempting to crawl away from Vincent. At the time of Timothy falling into the aisle and attempting to crawl away, he had been stabbed approximately 50 to 60 times, and he still had some kind of strength to try and get away. As Timothy fell in the aisle, Garnett, who was the first to figure out that Vincent was stabbing Timothy, tried to ask another man for help in detaining Vincent in order to try and stop him from killing Timothy. In my opinion, I do not think Garnett was aware just how many times Timothy had been stabbed and just how bad his injuries already were. But when Garnett asked the man if he would help him, the man refused and ran off of the bus. And at this point, the only people remaining on the bus are Vincent, Timothy, and Garnett. And Garnett was still planning to make some kind of effort to disarm Vincent and try to save Timothy's life. However, shortly after making his decision to disarm Vincent, Timothy stopped screaming, and the bus fell completely silent. And in that moment, Garnett knew that Timothy had passed away from his injuries, as Vince was still standing over him, stabbing him repeatedly in the aisle. Garnett said that blood was absolutely everywhere, all over the back of the bus, that the carpet on the bus was soaked in Timothy's blood. And again, Vincent was completely unfazed.
No, you said that Garnett was a member of the Canadian military. Did he have any weapons on him at the time, or was he also completely unarmed?
He was unarmed.
That has to just be a terrible thing for everybody on that bus. I mean, of course, terrible for Timothy, but for the people who survived this and had to witness it, especially Garnett being so close but not being able to do anything. I can only imagine how that haunts them.
I couldn't imagine. At this point, Garnett had also run off of the bus, and Vincent repeatedly and continuously stabbed Timothy's lifeless body. When Garnett gets off of the bus, he states that he saw all the other passengers just kind of standing there on the other side of the road in shock and in disbelief. Some passengers were crying, others were screaming, and some passengers had even gotten sick from the sight of what they had just witnessed Vincent do. And while this commotion was going on, a truck driver was passing by and sees the bus pulled over with all of these people standing around outside. And he pulls over to try to see if he can help the bus get back on the road. He essentially thought that maybe the bus was having a mechanical issue, and him being a truck driver, he would have some experience that would be able to help fix the bus and have the bus continue its journey. And this bus driver was 28-year-old Chris. And when Chris gets out of his truck, Garnett runs over to him and asks him if he has any weapons in his truck. Garnett informs Chris that there is a dangerous man on the bus. I do not believe they got into the details of it all, as I don't believe either of them thought they had time to do so. But Chris goes into his truck and he arms himself with a crowbar and he gives Garnett a hammer. And these two men, one of whom doesn't even know the full extent of what's going on that bus, make the decision to try and get back on the bus and disarm Vincent. So Garnett and Chris walk back onto the bus, armed with their crowbar and their hammer, and attempt to save the other passengers. But when they get back on the bus, they see Vincent kneeling over Timothy's lifeless body, and Vincent is attempting to decapitate Timothy with the hunting knife. And despite seeing this, Garnett and Chris still try to approach Vincent, but as they do, Vincent looks up at them, stands up from Timothy's body, and starts walking towards them with his hunting knife. And the two of them panic. I don't think they really calculated the idea of Vincent actually getting up and walking towards them. But the two of them panic and they both run off the bus when Vincent starts walking towards them. As they manage to get off the bus, they attempt to slam the door, but Vincent was right there behind them, and he had managed to get his arm with the hunting knife through the door before they could close it. And he was waving his arm around with the knife frantically. And initially, Chris and Garnett attempt to keep the doors closed as everyone else took off running for their lives. The other passengers truly believed that Vincent was going to get off of the bus and do the same thing he had done to Timothy to whoever he could catch. However, after a short while of fighting with the door, Vincent gave up, turned around, and returned to the bus and returned to where he left Timothy's body. The bus driver then shut and locked the door so Vincent would not be able to get off of the bus or drive it away. And after a short while, Vincent walks back to the front of the bus where the other passengers have returned upon realizing that Vincent would not be getting off of the bus. And as he walks to the front of the bus, he looks at all the passengers standing outside before lifting his arm and revealing Timothy's head, which he had successfully decapitated from his body.
This is literally like something out of a horror movie.
Yes. And I hate to be that person, friend, but it's just gonna get worse. People screamed in horror, and people who were on this bus have described this as the most traumatizing experience of their entire life. And Vincent was utterly expressionless as he held up Timothy's head to show all the passengers exactly what he had done. And then to add even more insult to injury, he just drops Timothy's head on the ground without any regard for him as a human being. And in that moment, the Canadian police finally arrived to the scene.
I was about to say, where are the police? Because, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine.
Don't get too excited, friend, because I have always heard people say that the Canadian authorities aren't really all that authoritative, but we're about to get to some utter shenanigans. So the police arrive, and they also witness Vincent carrying and dropping Timothy's head. The police saw this. The police are aware of what's going on. And instead of storming onto the bus to quickly disarm Vincent, they instead decide, because Timothy has already passed on and Vincent is locked on the bus, that there is no need to immediately rush on the bus and detain Vincent. Instead, they allow Vincent to be locked on the bus with Timothy's body for 4 hours.
4 hours?
Yes.
What were they doing in the meantime?
Oh, we're about to get into it, friend. We're about to get into exactly what happened over the course of those 4 hours.
What the f?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Again, this section of the case is going to be extremely graphic and extremely disturbing. So please bear with me for the next few minutes. So during the 4 hours, the police allowed Vincent to be locked on that bus with Timothy's body. The voices in Vince's head started talking to him again. And these voices told Vincent that despite the fact that he had already decapitated this young man, Timothy might come back to life in order to harm Vincent and the other passengers. So the voice commanded Vincent to destroy Timothy's body as much as possible. Again, this is graphic. So he goes back to Timothy's body, and with his hunting knife, he stabs Timothy in the chest and splits his chest open to reveal his internal organs. And he begins removing Timothy's internal organs from his body. And if that wasn't horrific enough, there were times when Vincent would stand up and show the different organs that he was pulling out of Timothy's body to the police and the passengers who were outside of the bus. And on several occasions, he would stand up and lick the blood off of his fingers after pulling different organs out of Timothy's body. And I would love to tell you that we're almost done with these horrific details, but unfortunately, it's just going to keep getting worse. So after Vincent was satisfied with the harm he had already done to Timothy's body, he returned to his head and decides to destroy Timothy's face. He removes Timothy's nose, both of his ears, his eyes, and his tongue. And again, Vincent stands up to show the police and the passengers exactly what he has done to Timothy's disembodied head. And shortly after that, he stands up and in full view of the police and the passengers, takes a bite out of Timothy's heart.
Oh my God. So my thing is, even if the police are saying, oh, Timothy has already passed, there's no more harm being done, the psychological harm that is being done to all of those passengers and to themselves by having to witness this does not warrant y'all getting on that bus and taking this man away.
I'm not going to ascend onto my soapbox just yet because I have very strong feelings about this fact in particular, the one that you have just brought up. But it is ridiculous. It is absurd. And there is actual police radio of them talking to each other, saying that the suspect is on the bus eating the victim.
Baggers at the back of the bus, hacking off pieces and eating it.
They are communicating this to each other. It's not like nobody is aware of what's going on that bus. And despite all of these horrific details I have described to you, the police still did nothing. And I'm not the only one who was baffled at the fact the police did not do anything to help Timothy. The passengers were also confused as to why the police were allowing Vincent to not only dismember Timothy in front of all of them, but now consume his body.
Desecration of a corpse is a whole nother charge. I don't know if it's different in Canadian law, but I would assume that is a charge that can be brought upon somebody. Like, are they not thinking about Timothy's family?
Maybe I will ascend my soapbox because that's the point that pisses me off. Because you have allowed this to go on and you take away the family's ability to have an open casket funeral for their child. There's no way they could do that. Because you allowed him to be locked on that bus for hours with his body. It's ridiculous. And this show of Vincent pulling out different organs and dismembering Timothy's body and eating different portions of Timothy's body lasted for 4 hours. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, 4 hours after the police had arrived on scene, not after the incident started, the voices in Vincent's head had decided that it was satisfied with what Vincent had done to Timothy's body. And Vincent breaks a back window in the bus and attempts to jump out of the window and make a run for it. Luckily, the Canadian police decide to finally do their job and detain and disarm Vincent and place him under arrest. So the only reason this assault ended is because Vincent left the bus, not because police interfered. And when the police searched for additional weapons or anything that could cause them harm on Vincent, the officers that were arresting him instead found Timothy's nose, ears, and tongue still in Vincent's pockets.
I just cannot understand how you, as somebody who is supposed to be serving and protecting, can sit and watch somebody do something so horrible for 20 minutes, let alone 4 hours, knowing that you have the tools at your disposal to stop this.
Exactly.
I can understand that they maybe didn't know if Vincent had any other weapons on him, but you're the freaking police. You have a team of people with weapons on you. Did they even, take people away from the scene?
No, all 36 passengers who decided to stay anywhere near this incident were right outside.
There is no way to justify their inaction. No way to justify that.
None whatsoever. Because let's be real, if this was in America, they would have been shot that bus up.
Oh, yeah.
And look, there's a happy medium between unloading a clip into the bus and doing nothing for 4 hours. Even the survivors, the other passengers were like, we thought they were going to fill the bus with tear gas and storm him or something. And they didn't do anything.
Right. How are these untrained civilians coming up with better action plans than you?
Right.
I know we haven't gotten to the trial or anything like that yet, but I hope his family sued the police for everything they had. And your lack of response tells me that even if they did, they didn't win. So that is, oh my gosh, that is just so despicable. And that whole unit should have gotten fired.
Absolutely, because I want to know, who did you serve and protect here? Because it does not feel like you served and protected anybody.
Other than yourself.
You didn't protect yourself, though. You sat out there and also watched the horrific dismembering and disembodying of another human being. You watched it. You talked about it over the radio. You took notes, but you didn't go onto the bus and get him. 2 civilians had more balls to go onto a bus and try to confront him than you did as a police officer, when it is your entire job to protect the public. 2 civilians had more guts than you did. You should be ashamed of yourself. You should be utterly ashamed of yourself. So, when investigators were finally able to get onto the bus and take in the massacre that they had allowed to go on for 4 hours, none of Timothy's body was still intact. His body parts were thrown in various places around the bus, and there was blood absolutely everywhere. As they were collecting Timothy's body parts that were scattered across the bus, they found Timothy's heart, but a third of Timothy's heart was missing. And officers believe that Vincent had consumed a third of Timothy's heart. But not only that, they were also unable to find Timothy's eyes, which they know were cut out of his head. So it is also believed that Vincent ate both of Timothy's eyes in addition to a third of his heart. And the only way they could collect Timothy's body in any attempt to allow him any dignity was to carry him away in individual plastic bags. Now that the standoff, and I use that term very, very loosely and heavily sarcastically, the police had finally arrested Vincent, and they took him to a hospital to get him checked out and evaluated because Vincent had also sustained several injuries as a result of his attack. After being examined by the doctors, Vincent was not held in police custody as a result of his crime. He was actually transferred to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, and so that professionals would be able to assess his mental state.
I think that part makes sense. At least I just hope that he was still being detained in a way, like still handcuffed and watched over. Because of course he needs psychiatric treatment, but he is still likely a danger to other people around him.
I do not know his exact confinement, but I do know that in general, psychiatric hospitals for dangerous people and people who commit crimes are typically confined in some way, just not as severe as prison or jail. There is a lot more freedom. I also use that term loosely. I can't think of a better word right now, but there is more freedom in terms of you are not confined to a cell. You can walk around, you can talk to doctors and people, and you have activities to do in a psychiatric hospital that you definitely don't get to do in prison. So while that was going on with Vincent, the 36 other passengers on the bus were taken in for police questioning. And the police also bought a hotel room for all of the individuals, as well as a change of clothes, because the bus was now a crime scene and the passengers were not allowed to access their belongings that were on or under the bus. And quite frankly, I wouldn't blame them if they didn't even want the things that were left behind on the bus knowing what happened. I know I wouldn't.
Right. At this point, the whole bus needs to be burned.
Absolutely. There is nothing salvageable here. Nothing. And after about 24 hours, the other passengers were allowed to leave the area and get on a different Greyhound bus in order to continue their journey to Winnipeg. And I'm sure every person from that bus is absolutely traumatized, and bus riding in general is absolutely ruined for them. So I can't imagine how the rest of that trip went for them. So after the passengers had been released, the media got wind of this story and did their thing and spread it like wildfire. And this is a bit about the case that really annoys me, because the media got a hold of this case, but the victim's name was withheld because the police had not identified Timothy's body yet and had not been able to contact his family to let them know what had happened to their son.
Were they not able to cross-reference the bus records? I mean, I really don't have much faith in their abilities as police officers, but I would assume that would have been the clearest way to identify who that was.
I do not know. Again, like you said with Darren, 8-year-olds playing Clue could figure this out quicker than these guys at this point. And this is the bit about this case that really, really moves me to tears. So I'm going to try my best. But Timothy's mother was working in an assisted living facility, And she had actually saw the news about this report and about this horrific murder that had happened on the Greyhound bus. And she was talking about it with other coworkers and other people in the assisted living facility, not knowing that it was her child who had been the victim of this horrific murder. And as the families of the people who lived in the assisted living facility ate dinner, they all said a prayer for the victim's family, not knowing the victim's family sat among them. And Carol was completely sure that the victim was not her son, and she thanked God that Timothy would be safe and would be coming home soon. In the following day, Timothy's family received the tragic information that the victim of the Greyhound bus murder was indeed their son. And it just breaks my heart that they heard about this story and they learned about the details of this story from the media and then had to find out that it was their child who left this earth in such a horrific way. That's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Like you said, hearing about the details of the case, knowing, oh my gosh, I can't believe that somebody would do that. I can't believe that somebody's going through that right now. And then learning that all those things that you heard happened to someone close to you.
And that you are the one that people are worried about.
You're anticipating joy because you think that your loved one is coming home soon, only to find out that not only are they not coming home, something so terrible, something so depraved happened to them.
Absolutely.
And I know the media loves to sensationalize things, and this is already a sensational case just by itself. So I'm sure all of these grimy details were in the media too. And I just know that it was rough for them putting those two together, putting all those details together once they learned that Timothy was the victim.
Absolutely. And I understand the importance of the media. I truly do. But when it comes to cases like this, it just feels so grimy and feels so gross. And it feels so disrespectful to put these details out there like this isn't a person with dignity and family and people who love them, to just put the worst thing that could have happened to them on full display for everybody. I just hate it. I just hate it. There's really no other way for me to say that. Now it's time to get back to talking about Vincent, who, remember, is currently being held in a psychiatric facility. After being in this facility for a little over a week, doctors realized that Vincent was extremely sleep deprived. They found out about his schizophrenia diagnosis and that he was prescribed medication for that diagnosis that he was not taking. And the doctor stated that his schizophrenia was about as bad as it could possibly be. And after a few days of giving him medication and allowing him to sleep, the doctors were able to restore enough competency for Vincent to be interviewed. He was first interviewed by a forensic psychologist, and in that interview with the forensic psychologist is actually where we get a lot of the thinking and statements that I have referenced in these last two episodes. But the one thing he said that really stood out to me is when he said, quote, "I am the evil son of God. God chose me as the killer and chose Tim McLean as the victim. God controls people for his own reasons." End quote. In this interview, he also asked if he was going to be executed because, according to Vincent, he said he deserved to die for his actions, which to me shows some mindset of knowing right from wrong. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. And over the next few months, Vincent would sit for 19 interviews with this forensic psychologist in an effort to piece together not only exactly what happened in this case, but what had led Vincent to where he was mentally. And on March 3rd, 2009, 9 months after the murder of Timothy Richard McLean, Vincent goes to trial.
I mean, it sounds like him finally getting on that medication and getting sleep started to give him some clarity, even if it didn't totally disabuse him of the notion that he was carrying out God's wishes. I think it started to give him some clarity of like understanding more what he did and how horrific it was.
Absolutely. So now that we're at trial, as you can imagine, Vincent's defense team goes with the obvious defense that Vincent cannot be held criminally responsible for his actions because of the severity of his schizophrenia at the time of the murder. And the forensic psychologist who sat and interviewed with Vincent 20 times also stated that Vincent cannot be held criminally responsible for his actions because of how severe his schizophrenia was at the time of the murder. And the severity of his schizophrenia did not allow him to have control over his actions. And after 2 days of evidence being presented, the judge in this case agreed with the defense team that Vincent Lee could not be held criminally responsible for the murder of Timothy Richard McLean. So while it does not mean Vincent will be going to prison for his crime, he is going to a psychiatric hospital to seek treatment. And at this psychiatric hospital, he would receive treatment for his condition and mental state and would be monitored closely and annually reviewed for release. In the aftermath of the trial, Timothy's family was utterly furious, and I completely understand the fury and the anger. They were not at all involved in the trial process when it came to prosecuting Vincent for the murder of their son. And when the judge made the decision that Vincent was not criminally responsible for the murder of Timothy, the family was not contacted, nor were they able to give a victim impact statement and address the court and the person who had taken their son away from them in such a horrific way. And Timothy's family took action by starting a petition to change the law around finding a person not criminally responsible for a murder. Because in Canada at the time, if you were found to be not criminally responsible, the only course of action was for you to go to a psychiatric facility where you would be monitored and you would eventually have the opportunity to be released as early as 1 year after your crime was committed. Unlike a prison sentence that would hold you for a minimum amount of time before giving you the opportunity to rejoin society. So they wanted to change the law and have it altered so that if you murdered someone, but you are not criminally responsible at the time of the murder, you will still have to serve some time in prison after your psychiatric treatment. And honestly, I don't know where I stand with this petition because on the one hand, I completely understand wanting the retribution that comes with sending a person to prison. However, I am also well aware of the detriment that prison can do to a person's mental health. And if their mental health is already fragile, do we want to add the extra level of stress to their mental health that comes with putting them in prison?
Right. I feel like that's a dilemma that I'm facing too. And with this case specifically, he did something so horrific, but at the same time, as the forensic psychologist said, his schizophrenia was so bad at that time that he was not in control of his actions. And mentally, he was not in a state where he could really have stopped himself. I also think that with something like schizophrenia, it's so important that people take their meds. But there are cases where people will stop taking their meds. Even if they've been on their meds for a long time, they might have a break or a trigger and they'll stop taking their meds. And psychiatric facilities are very controlled in the sense that you're not having a lot of triggers that can happen. You're in a very not safe environment, but you're in a very controlled environment. You expect that your meal is going to come at this time. You expect that you'll go outside at this time. You might socialize at this time. But I do think that there is a danger in just letting somebody back out into society, because there can be a lot of triggers that they could experience just in being out in the real world. And you're also making them the liable party to take the meds that they need to remain stable. And so I don't necessarily support just allowing somebody to go back into society. I think that it should be a case-by-case basis. I definitely think for something this horrific that a year is not nearly enough time to remedy any mental issues that they have. And in general, even for other less serious mental issues, like medication is not a long-term solution. It may help keep that person stable in the short term, but when you look at the success rates of even medication for things like depression, it is really not that high. I just don't think that our understanding of psychology, how the brain works, how medication can interact with the brain is advanced enough for us to be able to say, yep, this person is good to go back out into society without any concern that they're going to do something else to somebody. I also don't believe that prison is the solution, because as you said, that can be just a whole nother trigger for somebody. And even after they serve that sentence, do we release them back? They might be in a worse situation than they were.
Exactly.
I do agree that the setup now where somebody, if they're held not criminally responsible, goes to a psychiatric facility and could potentially be released within the year, I do agree that that is not the system that we want to have in place, especially if it's so inflexible that it could allow somebody who committed such a horrific crime to be eligible for that same option.
That was beautifully said. And you're absolutely right, because that's my qualm with it, right? If we send them to prison after their psychiatric treatment and they become worse, do we then force them back into psychiatric treatment with the hopes that they will be better and ready to re-engage with society again? But I do think there are times that someone just shows you that they do not need to walk amongst society. And I think when your delusions have become so violent as to murder Timothy in the way that Vincent did, to disrupt and disrespect his body on that level, and especially if the doctors are saying that this scenario is a direct result of him not taking his medication that was prescribed for him 3 years ago, I do not have faith that he will be stable enough to take care of himself. Prime example, let's say in a different scenario, somebody has schizophrenia and they punch somebody in the face out of fear. It's an assault, right? I'm all for you rejoining society because your actions were not devastatingly violent, you know, and you were probably scared and there was external factors that triggered you into doing what you did. Timothy was asleep with his headphones on. He spoke to Vincent when he sat down. He was very polite to him. Mind you, Vincent sat in the immediate seat next to him when he passed empty seats. So Timothy also could have been a jerk and been like, dude, why are you sitting next to me? And he wasn't. You completely, for lack of a better word, destroyed a kind innocent human being. And that is what is scary to me. It is scary that your delusions are to this level of violence. And I'm supposed to trust that if you are released back into society, you will just continue to take this medication for forever with the hopes that you will never relapse. That's scary.
Yeah.
So I would love to know what our listeners think about this potential idea and where you stand on this point specifically. So if you are listening on Spotify, please leave a comment on this episode and let me know what you think about this, because I'm very torn on the issue and I'm very curious what the greater society thinks about it. So in addition to the petition that Timothy's family started to change the law, they also filed a civil lawsuit against the Canadian police for not doing anything when they witnessed the damage that Vincent was doing to Timothy's body. And the family never received Timothy's body because his body was so dismembered and destroyed that there was nothing to send back to the family to bury. And this is what really pissed me off with the Canadian police, because you did not do anything to help Timothy. Because how could you deny this family the closure that many people need when it comes to a funeral and a burial? Some people are never able to let go of a person and move on until they bury them. And because of your negligence, your refusal to interfere with something that you saw was happening, you denied this family that closure. 2 parents and 6 siblings. Timothy had 6 siblings, remember? And nobody gets the closure of burying their son or their brother.
And do we know the outcome of the civil lawsuit?
I don't know.
They might have settled privately.
They could have settled privately, but it's always hard to sue the police.
I'm hoping that maybe it's a little bit easier to sue the Canadian police. Maybe their police aren't as politically strong as American police are. But either way, that family deserves every cent they were asking for, because it is unacceptable how they acted, how they treated that crime scene.
Absolutely. Absolutely ridiculous. Vincent's actions completely changed Timothy's family's life forever, because he took away a son, a friend, a brother from people who loved him dearly. And while Timothy's family suffered greatly from the loss of their son, they were not the only ones who suffered in this case. The other 36 passengers who witnessed this experience were utterly traumatized and had their lives changed forever. Chris, who was the truck driver who stopped on the side of the road in an attempt to help the Greyhound bus, shared that he has had to switch jobs as he no longer feels comfortable being a truck driver, and he is very fearful of being in large crowds and confined spaces. Another passenger, who was a student at the time and was doing well in his studies, would later drop out of college because his anxiety was so overwhelming. Other passengers have reported consistent nightmares about the night, as well as PTSD that has drastically changed the trajectory of their life. And at least 2 passengers have taken their lives after this horrific murder. I do not know the exact context as to what triggered them into that decision. 2 passengers from the 1170 Greyhound bus also sued Vincent Lee himself and the Greyhound bus station company, as well as the Canadian government. And they were seeking compensation for being exposed to this horrific murder and the lack of police interference. They also wanted more security on the Greyhound buses from now on in order to prevent another case like this from happening. However, the lawsuit was dismissed, and this pair did not receive any compensation for any of the previously stated entities.
I can maybe understand them dismissing the lawsuit against the Greyhound bus company. But to dismiss the lawsuit against the government, against the police, you had me sitting here watching this man just desecrate this other man's body. Like, watch this man do horrible things, and you did nothing. I can imagine the continuing state of fear that these passengers felt having to witness this. So I don't see how any judge could look at what the police did, or better yet, what the police didn't do, and say, nope, you don't deserve any compensation.
Yep. And finally, when it comes to the stories of these passengers, another passenger had her child taken away from her at birth because her PTSD was so severe, and it was well documented at the time of the incident, and the doctors were concerned that the mix of this PTSD and postpartum depression could have severe consequences should they leave the child in her care. I will say that as far as my research goes, I do believe that after a few years of treatment and therapy, she was able to have her child returned to her. But she is still supervised and checked in with often.
But those are formative years that she'll never get back.
Exactly. And what I'm about to tell you is going to sound comical if we look at these two scenarios of how they responded to this woman and taking away her child and what they're about to do going forward. So while I wish this would be the end of our episode, I have one more fun piece of information to share with you. And that is that in 2016, 8 years after this horrific murder that touched and changed the lives of at least 45 people, Vincent Lee was released from the psychiatric hospital. During his annual review in 2016, reviewers decided that he was fully treated and that he was no longer a risk to himself or to society. His name was changed to Will Baker. However, I do believe his name has been changed again, and he was allowed to rejoin the rest of society in a relatively independent capacity. He was still required to check in with the psychiatric hospital so they could ensure that he was adjusting to life appropriately and was still taking his medication. And they wanted to keep an eye on how his schizophrenia was evolving. However, 1 year later, in 2017, the doctors decided that Vincent no longer needed their supervision, and he was granted absolute discharge, meaning he was no longer required to check in with the psychiatric hospital, that he was 100% responsible for taking care of himself and his own mental health and ensuring that he takes his prescribed medication.
Are you kidding me?
I wish I was, friend.
The monitoring was the least they could do. And that should have been a lifelong thing. Because we've seen what he is capable of when he's not on his medication, when he did not have that supervision. And I agree with them that it probably wouldn't be a day and night thing where he stops taking his meds and then tomorrow he's going to commit a crime as horrendous as he did. But at the very least, you should still be checking in with him regularly to make sure that he is not regressing and that the schizophrenia is not getting worse.
They absolutely should. But are they? Nope.
To me, it just feels like they didn't want to deal with the paperwork.
I don't know what it was, honestly. It's just so baffling. I really don't have another word for it other than baffling. And as you can imagine, this caused public outrage. Because how could you release this person back into society 100% independent only 9 years after the gravity of what he did to Timothy? And Timothy's mother, Carol, flat out said that she was disgusted that he gets to walk around and rejoin society after taking her son away from her and her family.
The other thing is, I can only imagine, either Timothy's family or one of these passengers seeing him just out and about.
And how triggering that could be. How horrifically triggering that could be. To look into the eyes of the person you saw eat another human being. It's absurd. It's crazy. It is the craziest thing I've ever heard.
Like, people serve more time for robbing banks. People serve more time for embezzlement.
People serve more time for weed.
People serve more time for weed. There is clearly something wrong with that law that if it allows something like this to happen. Even if they feel like he's ready to integrate back into society, you still need to be monitoring him. To me, there is not an option for him to be fully discharged and fully independent. He needs to be monitored. Even if that monitoring comes in the form of regular check-ins.
Required therapy. Something.
Exactly. Somebody needs to keep track of how this man is doing.
Exactly. Timothy Richard McLean was described as an incredibly loving, friendly, charismatic person who lived his life to the absolute fullest and loved nothing more than meeting new people and going on every fun adventure he could manage. His brother described him as a modern-day nomad, and his family absolutely loved and cherished him deeply. And the saddest part about this case, if it couldn't get any sadder as it is that 6 years after Timothy's murder, the public was alerted that Timothy was actually a father-to-be. And 5 months after Timothy's death, his son was born. A son who will never know his father. A son who will unfortunately grow up to learn not only what happened to his father, but that his father's murderer is free to walk among them. And I'm a sensitive person, and I'm especially sensitive when it comes to children. And it just breaks my heart that this little boy doesn't even get a chance to grow up with his father. Timothy's son is currently 14 years old and is being raised by Timothy's mother, her husband, Timothy's father, and the mother of the child. While Timothy's murderer, Vincent Lee, Will Baker, or whatever alias he has decided to give himself now, gets to live his life as a free man, in my opinion, with no consequences for his actions. And that is the end of our story, friend.
If the audience could just join us in giving 2 middle fingers to the Canadian police, that would be great. Because I cannot say this enough. Their inaction was just inexcusable. The other thing I'll say is that while Timothy's family was not able to receive his body to bury him as he would have wished, I do find something beautiful in the fact that they are able to be involved in his child's life.
Absolutely.
And that they still have something of his in their life. And I hope that, well, I'm sure that as Timothy's son grows up, they see parts of Timothy in him. And they can still share the beautiful memories that they had with him, with his son, even though he wasn't able to have those experiences with his father himself.
Exactly. And it's just so unfair. It's so unfair that you took such a bright light from the world. This might be cold of me to say, but you did that. and you got away with it. And I understand the severity of mental health. I understand how it takes a toll and completely changes people. I really do. But there is a difference between a murder and what Vincent Lee did to Timothy Richard McLean. This is beyond that. This crime, the amount of damage that was done to Timothy, to not give him any dignity at the end of his life, should have gotten Vincent locked up forever. And because of his mental health struggles and his refusal to acknowledge his mental health struggles, it led him to do something so horrific. And subsequently, I also feel very strongly that if the Canadian police had just done anything, had bothered to treat Timothy with dignity from one human to another human, I actually would not be nearly as disgusted by Vincent as I am. Because the only reason any of the second half of what happened to Timothy's body happened at all is because he was allowed to be locked on that bus with him for 4 hours. If you don't give him 4 hours on that bus, you give a family a body to bury at bare minimum. And this case just hurts me in every way imaginable. I feel awful for his child. I feel awful for his family. I feel awful for the other victims on the bus who didn't get justice. Nobody got justice in this case, and that sickens me.
Nobody won. Do we know anything about Anna, what happened with her in this aftermath?
I do not know.
Yeah, I could only imagine how painful that was for her too. Just already the pain of losing a partner and then finding out that they did something so horrific and that you were married and lived with somebody that had the capacity to do that.
And not only that, but you were the first person to see the signs. You were the first person to see him going off the rails, and you were never able to help him get back on the track. And that's clearly not her fault. She does not need to feel guilty about that in the slightest, but I'm sure that's especially hard for her to think about.
It was a rough one.
This was definitely a rough one. And before we close out today, listeners, please go hug somebody you love. Go tell them you love them. If you have a parent, give them a call. I hope that you all are okay. This case is rough. This case is heavy. And I think this case kind of also highlights how fleeting life is and how quickly somebody can be taken away from us for the most senseless reasons. And with that, I wish you well. I wish you all a relaxing rest of your day. Hopefully I didn't ruin it too much for you. And take care of yourselves. Thank you for joining us on this episode. I'd like to thank Daniel Kirsty and Law and Crime for providing most of the material for this episode. If you'd like to check out photos related to this case, please be sure to follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram and TikTok.
And listeners, if you would like to continue supporting the podcast, please be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish podcast. And if you are listening on Spotify, feel free to leave any comments or questions, especially when it comes to thinking about what was the correct course of action in terms of justice for this case. And as always, stay nosy, stay safe, and take care of yourselves. Bye.
Bye, everyone.